maybe too much. Hi everyone, my name is Katie. I'm a farrier like all of you, but in my first career I was involved in science, and I haven't lost that desire to keep doing science. And so I am very lucky that I work in a place where I'm able to carry stuff out. So this is the first of hopefully many studies that I'm able to carry out at UConn. And I very much learned from Jennifer Horn in her Tuesday lecture that I should introduce myself. So you'll notice that I don't have a master's or a PhD behind my name, despite the fact that I was a researcher before I was a farrier. I did 10 years of training in science, 4 years with Dr. David Townsend, who is the picture on your left. And then I did the body of my scientific work with Sunit in the middle. And Kurt rounded out a major rehaul of my writing and helped me learn how to write grant applications. And Kurt was my PhD advisor and very gracefully let me bow out of his lab in my PhD when I decided that playing under ponies was way more fun. So that was pretty good of it. So this study comes from my road to the journeyman. I was transitioning out of my PhD. I was starting training for my journeyman, and I noticed that when I rode my personal horse, when I practiced a journeyman run on him, I felt the change in him, and my trainer could call what was on his feet based on how he went. And that was really interesting to me. If I got lazy and used 3/4 fuller kid shoes, she called it pretty immediately. So when I went to New Hampshire, I started my business over again, and you get those clients that don't really have a lot of money. You're the new kid in town, they're trying you out. And so when they would come to me and they would say, my horse is lame in the hind end, I would remember my time with Jack and use plain stamp shoes as something that maybe could help them out, but also then I got to do half a journeyman run. So it was a pretty big win-win in my book. And some of these clients, I told them if I changed something up, and other clients I didn't tell them that I changed anything up. And across the board, everyone felt that their horses were going better. So this began to be more of a thing, right? This was more than just one horse. It was multiple horses. It's all anecdotal still, but I had a hypothesis for me. And that hypothesis is that a reduction in traction, specifically in the hind end, improves soundness in horses. And you can do that by applying metal to the bottom of the foot, using plain stamp as opposed to 3/4 fuller, and applying a wider width of metal to the foot. And my rationale for this was that traction in the hind end, or reduction of traction in the hind end, allows for slide side to side, unilaterally, and forward and backwards, or dorsal plantarly, that is easier on soft tissue and potentially osteoarthritic joints than hard stops that traction would cause. And so if that's true, then plain stamps could be used as a complement to existing lameness strategies. And most of these horses are shod all the way around anyway. There's no extra cost involved in this as a potential treatment. So COVID disrupted this like it disrupted many things. We kind of felt that it was a gift in the end. All the horses had their shoes pulled at the university, and they were all turned down out with the lockdown to help save money. So they were like this for 6 months, and 6 weeks prior to the start of the study, which coincided with the start of the semester, they were all entered into this fitness program so that fitness was not a problem for the students riding, and fitness was not a problem for this study. At the beginning of this fitness program, all of them were pretty crippled, and at the end, you'll see in the next slide that they were still lame to an extent, but fitness shouldn't have been a variable. So we used that as an opportunity to make barefoot our control, which was not our original aim. And I should back up a little bit. This is a pilot study. A pilot study is a piece of a larger study that allows you to troubleshoot anything that you are unsure of in your So in this case, we went back and forth on whether we should evaluate these horses at the end of their cycle, or I should shoe them and then evaluate them right away. We felt that that was 50-50. You know, we could make the right choice or the wrong choice. So we did this pilot study to see how it went at the end of the cycle. We also wanted to see which lameness assessment was most successful and most honest with what we were trying to see. So that was the reason why we ended up finding something completely different out of this study than the original hypothesis. So we did barefoot, they were evaluated, and then they were shod. 6 weeks go by, they were reset. 6 weeks go by, they're evaluated, and then they're reset. Our groups were a little bit diverse. The horses in blue are lesson horses. Those are majority of Morgans. Andy is an Andalusian, and Gunther is a Frisian Morgan cross. Most of those Morgans are related, and they do flat work and low-level jumping. The horses in white are all thoroughbreds. They're polo ponies. In this study, they didn't play polo. The university still wasn't allowed to compete, so they did polo practices and flat work during the duration of the study. We used the initial evaluation of lameness in the barefoot condition. We took the AAEP Scores, which is a measure of lameness that vets use pretty commonly, where 0 is sound and 5 is three-legged lame. So you can see we have two conditions. We have three-quarter fuller and we have a plain group. And the horses, in terms of job and in terms of breed, are as spaced out as we can make it. And if you were to average the AAP scores all the way over on that screen, both of those groups come out to the same number. So their spread of lameness is pretty similar, their jobs are pretty similar. We didn't try to stack one group versus the other to try to manipulate the data. So to go over AAP scores in a little bit more depth, like I said, the extremes are sound to three-legged lame. In the little diagram in the corner there, it gets a little bit more specific, but there's gradations between 0 and 5 that are useful in figuring out how severe the lameness is. And we use mixed practice veterinarians because it was a good practical measure of what people use every day in the field. There are a lot of sport horses, but there are many more pleasure horses. And we found that mixed practice veterinarians were more representative of more horses than a true lameness veterinarian would be. Also, these two people volunteered. We had no money for this study, and so in the end we didn't have a choice, but we also felt that it reflected well upon a real life scenario. Their scores were averaged together for each time point, and that was the number that was used in analysis, and they were blinded to each other, so they didn't know what the other one was scoring the horse. They watched horses go on the straight, and they watched them on the lunge line to determine the scores. We didn't do any flexion tests. It was just straight up, how are they in this moment? And we would have loved to have made definitive diagnoses for each horse as to exactly what lameness each one of them had. But again, we had no money for this study. It just wasn't an option. But oftentimes, with this study being a farrier-related audience, how many times have you guys heard an owner say, I can't afford to have the vet out, do the best you can? I bet most of us have. And so, again, we thought this was like a very real-world way to approach our study. The second method of lameness detection we used is the lameness locator. And this includes this little hat that sits over their head, a sensor that sits on their SI joint, and then a sensor that sits on the right floor around the fetlock. And you trot your horse, ideally 18 to 24 strides, sometimes even more, and then you repeat that 3 times. And the reason that you repeat that 3 times is that there are a lot of variables that can contribute to how accurate this is. So if your handler is pulling the head one way or the other, that's going to affect the numbers that are spit out at you. If your horse is going faster or slower, to an extent, that affects this test. So if you take a total of 3 runs, it cuts down on that noise. And this generates what's called a Q score for each horse. And that's really useful for veterinarians, and it's designed to compare a horse's condition over time. Unfortunately, it's not used to compare one horse to another horse. And my husband's a chemist, and he's pretty handy at math, and he and I spent an entire Sunday one day trying to figure out how we could compare these Q scores like it's been done in the peer-reviewed literature. And every time we got to the end of the analysis, we couldn't, because it didn't mean anything. The Q score was strictly for the individual. So what we did instead, and this is novel to this study, is we took the descriptors that the Lameness locator gives you, which is no evidence, very mild evidence, moderate evidence, or severe evidence of a lameness, and I changed those into scores from 0 to 4, and I did what's called the delta, where you take one point in time and you subtract it from another point in time, and then you measure the difference. And like I said, with the noise, numbers were dropped if they were not within one of one another in the runs. And the reason for that is that some of the horses didn't act very well, and so one of their runs was basically not accurate to their gait. I found kinematics to be the coolest thing because I had in my head, reading papers leading up to this study, that it was this big involved process. And it turns out that it's really quite simple. We use duct tape squares, and we put them on the point of a bunch of joints. And our approach was, we don't know at this point what's going to be useful and what's not going to be useful, because this is a pilot study. These are the questions that we're trying to ask. And so we ended up with the wing of the ilium, the point of the buttock, the patella, the point of hock, the caudal side of the hock, the lateral aspect of the hock, the lateral aspect of the fetlock, and the caudal side of the fetlock. So once we had those duct tape squares on there, they were just trotted across camera on a tripod. And this Noraxon software is able to take those duct tape dots and put numbers on the angles between the dots as they move. And we got a lot of data out of that, and it was really quick. I'll end up playing one of the videos for you guys during the presentation so you can see how quick and easy this is. Shoeing wise, I would have loved to use Mark Caldwell's already published trimming procedure, because it's already been published and it's established in the literature, and it would have been really cool to build on that. I was ill at this point, and so it was really difficult for me to be consistent with that, and I had 14 horses to get through, and if it weren't for Jack pictured here, I wouldn't have been able to get all the shoes built. He helped me build the shoes, and I handled all the footwork and the peg shoe shaping. So I ended up using the certification guide, and if it was a score of 7 or higher in the shoe building, in the trim, and the whole finished product, then it went. And that was my method for shoeing. And this is really cool because a lot of us shoe to this AFA certification guide, at least in basis, for our everyday work. I like to see conformations of the horses in these studies. I always find myself wondering what they looked like when I hear a scientific study, because horses come in all different shapes and sizes. This is a very representative Yukon organ. They're very base narrow. They're chunky in the butt. They have a lot of the old school lipid blood, and they have a lot of the California bloodlines. Everyone pretty much knows what a thoroughbred looks like, but I put one in anyway. This is a representative polo pony. And so now we move to data analysis and statistical significance. So this is an AP topic. No one really likes to spend too much time on this. You guys have been to one of the AFA research journal clubs. We talk about it quite a bit. And I was told that I should break this down a little bit more simply than I did initially when I ran this by a few people a couple weeks ago. So I decided to explain it in terms of candy. If you have a bag of M&Ms, say you wanted to know if the amount of yellow M&Ms was statistically significantly different than the rest of the colors in your bag. Say you're like, there's just too much yellow in this bag. I don't think there's an even spread. Well, what this little graph is 0.05, or 95% statistical significance threshold. And basically what that means is back in the day, a bunch of scientists across disciplines decided that that was our threshold for whether something was actually different from the population. So you would think of the population under this bell curve, and then that wing, that blue shaded area, is different from the rest of that curve. And that blue shaded area can be on the other side of the graph as well. That's called two-tail. This diagram is just illustrating one tail. Our statistical test was a mixed model test. And again, in Journal Club, we talk all the time about wanting the simplest statistical test possible for your data set. And this is because the more complex the statistical test is, the more I think you toy with your data. So I want to see something that's really simple in terms of statistics, because otherwise I feel like you're trying to get a narrative out of something that's not there. And statistics can be manipulated in that way, so it's good to be cautious about it. We chose this model test because we had fixed effects and random effects. Fixed effects are the breed of the horse, a height of an adult horse. They don't change. Random effects are when a variable measure could be different in each individual. So for example, a thoroughbred may not have as much hawk action as a Morgan, but it also could. So that's not consistent within the breed. We also did have a few missing data points. I mentioned before that we had a few horses that were upset, particularly with the Lameness locator cap. One horse that we only were able to collect 2 runs because she became very emotionally distressed about her hat. So we were unable to do that, and this test actually deals really well with missing data points like that. So here we are. This is table 2. This data pertains directly to my original hypothesis, which was that plate stamp is going to improve lameness compared to 3/4 colored shoes. And if you look at that p-value, I had told you before that we strive for 0.05 or less. And you can see, if you look in that p-value column, that all of those numbers are greater than 0.05. So there was not even anything close to a trend in the AAEP scores, the Lameness locator, or the kinematic analysis. We failed to show that there's a soundness difference between these 2 shoes. What was interesting is, anytime you do a scientific study, you get data back, and you just want to run it in every particular way that you can. In particular, my boss for this project is, she loves to just tweak the data in different ways. And so one of the things that she did was she was like, well, we did barefoot, so we should compare barefoot to shod. And when she played with that, out came these really significant p-values. We were able to show that there was quite a statistical significant difference between barefoot and shod and AAEP scores, and in several values of kinematic analysis. And that was pretty exciting to us. So for those of you that see graphs better, this is what it looks like in graph form. And I like this slide because it looks like between Fuller and Plain Stamp in the blue graph that there's a huge difference also. But I want you guys to pay attention to the scale on both sides. It's pretty misleading. So anytime that you are looking at scientific literature or you're looking at a graph period, make sure you check the scale. So what this amounted to in the AAEP scores was a 44% increase in soundness between barefoot and shod in AAEP scores. And that's a big number. So I was thrilled about this because this is basically proving that the AFA certification is onto something. It's keeping horses sound. So this is a video of Emma. Is she coming? There she is. Emma was the lamest horse in the study initially. She received a score of 3. So this is her strutting her free. You can see that the duct tape squares are visible throughout the whole thing, so the computer was able to catch and track them. And thanks to Dr. Avery for making sure I had this video in here. And this is in the second condition where she's been shot. Here she scored a 0.5 AAP score. when it was average. Sorry, I can't hear you.
She had a 3 to barefoot.
Yes.
But a 0.5 to
Yes. Yeah. So the lameness locator we found was not very effective for the question that we wanted to ask. The lameness locator's main assumption is that the more symmetrical a horse moves, the more sound it is. And the major issue with this is a lot of our organs suffer from stifle issues bilaterally. And a few of the ones where you watch them go and you're just like, man, that's a train wreck. The lameness locator actually had them dead sound. That obviously wasn't going to be a useful measure for us because the kinematics and the AAEP scores tracked very well with one another, and they said that horse was very, very lame. So I just don't think that it helps us answer our question. I don't think that it's a useful mode. I think that it probably complements other experimental designs really well, but our lesson from this pilot study is that it wasn't for us. What was interesting about it, and I would like to run the kinematics data on this as well, I just don't have as much access to that data set as I do to this one. When I was doing my fun playing with data phase, is that we switched 7 of these horses, there were 14 initially, and the ones that were in Fuller went plain stamp, and the ones that were in plain stamp went Fuller. And what came out of this was that I couldn't predict who would favor what, but some horses clearly favored conditions over other conditions. And getting back to Doug's talk about how he sometimes was successful with his theory and his shoeing, and sometimes not in the Hind-End, it got me thinking about this slide, because it's Sorte and Celebration have pretty similar responses. They really don't like barefoot, and they really don't like plain stamp, but they really like Fuller. Those are 2 completely differently conformed animals. So I wouldn't have been able to predict that they would have liked the same thing. So I did find that to be interesting out of the lameness locator data. So lastly, for kinematics, it's assumed that a reduction in hop angles and an increase in stance time, a decrease in stance time is associated with lameness. And so maximum hop angle significantly increased in our study from week 0 to week 12 in the shod horses. And that indicates a healthier swing phase and a maximum use of the lip. Stance time was also significantly improved in both the left and the right limbs. And again, that longer stance time indicates that the horses were more comfortable with loading that limb. So, in conclusion, the kinematics and the AAEP scores closely agree with one another compared to the lameness locator data. To our knowledge, this is the first study that uses all 3 of these lameness assessments in their study. And that was pretty neat as far as science goes. And I also wonder, and I'm not a vet, so I guess I can't say this for sure, but I would think that this has implications for training vets in reading lameness if you can use kinematics in that way. And that was something, again, that we wouldn't have anticipated coming out of this study. Again, we used all 3 because this is a pilot study, and we were unsure which one was most appropriate for us. It turned out that none of these were sensitive to pick up a change in relation to barefoot versus three-quarter fuller shoeing. If there is one, there might not be one. We've had so many people tell us that there is a difference, including in this study. I asked those kids at UConn all the time how the horses are moving. They don't think anything of it. They didn't even know there was a study going on. And instead of asking them how they felt in this shoe versus that shoe, I would ask them how that horse felt in January versus how that horse felt in March. And I got some pretty interesting responses, and the one that made me think the most was a polo rider who was riding, it was Suerte actually, throughout the semester. And she said, it's interesting that you asked me that question, because in January, she felt so good. She was just so comfortable, everything was so fluid. And then in March, all of a sudden it became really easy to get her round. So there must be something involved in traction that allows them to make themselves rounder easier if they have it. But as far as the feel goes, people at least, tend to prefer the plain stamp. So it could be that we're not going to pick up a lameness difference. And we talk all the time at this barn about the difference between soundness and performance. And this might be one of those things where the horses are all sound, but they perform better in this modification. Excuse me. So I wanted to talk a bit about peer review because it's something that a lot of you don't get to experience. This paper was accepted for publication literally yesterday. I got the email in the morning. We went through 2 rounds of major revisions and 2 different sets of reviewers, and that's weird. Usually you'll go through at least 2 rounds of major revision, but it'll be the same reviewers. And so that threw us off quite a bit because when we got to the second set of reviewers, we actually didn't know if we properly answered the questions of the first. And so that was a little bit challenging to work with. But we also got 2 very different types of reviewers in this, and I'll pull up some of the reviews that we got. So this one was really, really helpful. It's to the point, it's really easy in their comments to address what they thought could be made better. The criticism that they give in general was very helpful. And you know, we're all big girls in this study, like we can handle a little bit of constructive criticism, but in the next review, these are 2 separate reviewers. It was like they didn't read the same paper. And that was really frustrating because they often kept referencing that we didn't include things in our study that we did include in our study. And so basically the way that we had to handle this is Sarah had to write back, please see line X, please see line Y, and just hand it in and do the best that we can. And out of these 2 reviewers, some of the comments were so bizarre that it was kind of like they were trying to look for an excuse to not publish it. And one of those is at the bottom, where they wanted to know what our bedding was, which I suppose could be related to lameness, but then they needed to know what the diet was and if it changed throughout the study. And with this being such a simple study, I didn't really see a need for that. So we ended up addressing the bedding in that final product, but we ended up pretty much ignoring the diet comment because it had remained the same throughout. There was no reason for anything to change. So this is the favorite line that I have in this paper, and when Sarah sent me her review her draft after my draft, I read this and I partied pretty hard. In most of the equine studies to date with farriery, people will shoe a foot in whatever shoe they want to test. And then all they'll do is measure hoof morphology changes and document them and extrapolate how that affects the horse. Not many studies to date actually do a farriery condition and then test lameness. And so I liked this sentence, which is the focus on hoof morphology is likely due, at least in part, to the difficulties in objectively measuring lameness. And we got a lot of comments about how some of these measures of lameness are better than others, which is precisely why we ran the study in the first place. But at least we attempt to show whether a change in farriery is positive or negative, where it matters, in soundness. So, I should finish reading this. However, it's unclear how these changes may have relate to lameness and or gait symmetry. That's referring to those hoof morphology changes. So I really enjoyed that. She knows that. So future directions. Like I told you guys, this was a pilot study for a more in-depth investigation on this subject. We actually have teamed up with a pretty incredible woman who knows steel incredibly in terms of like the material of it. And she has all sorts of tricks up her sleeve to help us measure that difference between soundness and performance. And so our next step is to test that and see if we can't show an improvement in soundness, can we show an improvement in performance. So to do that, we would probably build a pressure map and combine the kinematic data with the pressure map data to give a 3D representation of what the limb is actually doing. Footing obviously plays quite a big role in this. These horses were evaluated on really sticky synthetic footing. This footing is not supposed to get wet, and a few years ago, this arena flooded, and it is particularly bad. these horses blow proximal suspensories like nobody's business, and the only thing that's changed, or the only thing that hasn't changed, rather, over years of them blowing proximal suspensories is this footing. So my guess is that's what it is. So I think that probably this will show the most dramatic difference in anything that we change, but it would be cool to do it in sand and in grass and see if the effect is larger or smaller or no different. Again, we would love to match Lameness diagnoses to shoeing jobs. So if we got money, we would love to do that. And we could also still do more in-depth shoe wear analysis, as I still do have the shoes from this study. We just haven't chosen what we're going to do with that yet. So these are all the people that I need to thank. Sarah Reed is our fearless leader. Kristen Morgan is a human kinematics master. Lisa Streff organized all the horses for us, and these two students, Charlotte and Julia, held horses and ran with them. They did kind of the hard work, actually. Rachel and Alex are our lameness assessment vets. Julia ran the lameness locator, and Jack helped me build shoes. But I'd also like to thank Doug Russo because he gave me a lot of advice during this study. And anybody that's heard me give this talk in the past 6 weeks and has helped me shape this, you guys were immensely helpful. But before I'm done, I'd like to plug AFA Research. For those of you that don't know that we have a research program, this is the type of study that we're looking to fund. And if you have anything that pertains to the hoof or the artifarriere, it's fair game to submit to us. Thanks to a generous donation by Walt Taylor and the World Farriers Foundation this year, we'll likely be able to expand our grant sizes, which is awesome. Thank you to Walt. We fund 1 to 2 grants a year, and we actually don't decide what those are. We send these grants out to 2 academic reviewers and 2 farrier reviewers, and the best scores get funded. That's how we handle that. The program will set farriers up with people like Sarah and Kristen to help you out. We don't just like say, we know you're not trained in science, have at it. We give you tools. If you have somebody in mind that you'd like to work with that's an academic, absolutely suggest them. And if you aren't ready for your own project, I would love to see all your faces in Journal Club. This is just a Zoom meeting that we do every other month where one person leads discussion. We all read the paper, and we all talk about it. And you can just sit in the background and listen if you want. We're pretty proud of these guys. Travis Burns was the first person that used the AFA Research Fund. He sought to see if quarter crack patch strengths vary across different methods. Scott Bushaw, Brian Strelo, and Cody Bogart will be presenting their work later this afternoon, so I hope that you attend those. I'll let them tell you what their research is about. And Diego is our newest award recipient, and he is studying the effects of wedge pads on gait kinematics and hoof morphology. So with that, you guys have any questions? Yes, Ken? I have not tested sliding plates. It is something that would be cool because it has like a wider web, might amplify that effect. You're saying that they make some lamenesses better? Is that what you said? Yeah. Yeah, and actually this is not a new idea. Like this is not actually just my idea. Studying for the TE, I read even a sentence in Chris Gregory's book that says that he uses plain stamp shoes in some of his rodeo horses because he finds it makes them go better. And there are some FW projects that have now been published on the Worshipful Company site that also use plain stamp in their projects. So by no means is this a new concept. This is just, to my knowledge, the first time that it's been tested. Yes? I can't hear you, sorry. Yes. So these horses live just in a regular pine tree.
What was the question?
Sorry. The question was what surface were these horses living on and what surface were they tested on? They were tested only on that synthetic footing. They were worked only on that synthetic footing. But they live in just regular box stalls with pine shavings and they're turned out at night. And it is pretty muddy. It's New England, so it's wet, dry. So all the problems that are associated with that come with it. Yep. Yes, sir. So that's what Dr. Frame is going to help us out with. The bigger study addresses that much better than this study does. This isn't like, this is implied, right? So the other thing that got brought up when I was presenting this to a bunch of people, and I believe it was Kelly Liptrop, asked me what I thought about the effect of purchase. And I hadn't considered that. But if you have a barefoot horse compared to a shod horse, when that horse's toe digs into that footing, that's going to probably improve or change their gait status in some degree. So I actually don't know if this effect is due to a reduction in traction from adding metal, or if it's due to that effect of purchase. So I meant to say that, and you hit on that. Yes?
I was just curious.
Yeah, one picture of the nail head sticking out beyond the flat surface of the shoe. If this horse is on a synthetic footing, would that not act like a cleat stick? It create more hop issues than it would like slipping on that synthetic surface?
Yeah, they walk on concrete so often that that disappears within a week. But initially, probably. That's one of the reasons that we ended up leaving it 6 weeks and evaluating them at the end of the cycle.
But how can you evaluate, you got a nail head sticking out on a synthetic surface, how can you evaluate the shoulder from 6 weeks to 6 weeks with that acting as a cleat?
But it only acts as a cleat for a few days. Because the nail head wears down after a few days.
What was the question, Katie?
The question was, nail heads were sticking out a bit from the plain stamp shoe, and they were. And how does that affect our assessment in terms of our hypothesis being about traction?
Since you said they're lesson horses and polo horses, did you factor age at all into that? Do you have any data on that, or do you have any plans for that, or did I just miss it?
I have to go back and look because we might have. I know we talked about sex. We must have because they are pretty well.
Are they?
Yeah.
I would just.
I don't have their exact numbers, but I have their ballpark. They are pretty well spread. Yes, Doug?
Is there limits to the distance that kinematics can measure? So, in other words, can you measure it with the horse moving away from you, or does it have to be a precise distance with the horse going across?
I would imagine that you could measure stance time moving away from you, but it would be really hard for the software to measure hop angles. But it probably could do range of motion. So you could probably, depends on what variable you're looking for.
So you could potentially see medial lateral movement of the hops going away?
You might be able to. So the question was, could you assess a horse with kinematics coming away from you as opposed to crossing the camera laterally? That's something that I will have to follow up with Kristen about, but I can let you know what she says. Anyone else? Yes.
So in your initial analysis, they were barefoot all the way around, correct?
Correct.
So the scale is pretty fast from 0.5 to 3. Was there any horse in that scale, or the 12 horses that you did, that was lame on the front end at the beginning of your study?
So the question was there any horses that were lame in the front end at the beginning of the study? We actually didn't test the front end at all. We didn't have the vets look at the front end at all. The lameness locator automatically gives you data for that, so that's why I had the whole horse, the front of the horse, and the hind end of the horse. But as far as the AAEP scores went and the kinematics went, we didn't even have to look at the front end. We just said it's about the hind end.
Well, do you think that front end lameness can affect hind end lameness?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah. With this being a pilot study, our intent was just to figure out what we should do for this larger study. We didn't anticipate anything to come out of it, really. Our goal was, hey, we might get something that helps us get grant money later, but we didn't expect to pay